if you would like to go ahead and get started, the floor is yours.
That's how we start the Jubilees. That is actually one of the traditions that I found the Sharaf or uh, it's called the Yobeel, was a ram's horn that was blown to signify the start of the Holy Year. Uh, as any good Catholic knows, our faith is a constant calendar of beautiful traditions and special celebrations, some or many of which are not directly related to Holy Scripture as much as they were simply introduced or developed by our clergy in order to draw specific attention to the practice of our faith. The concept of a holy year has deep roots in the history of the Catholic Church and is usually centered around a pilgrimage to Rome, spiritual renewal, and the forgiveness of sins. The historical beginning of Jubilee is first found in ancient Hebrew religion. So first, we all need to know the difference between Hebrews and Jews. Well, a Hebrew was any member of an ancient northern Semitic people that were actually the ancestors of the Jews. Biblical scholars use the term Hebrews to designate the descendants of the patriarchs of the Hebrew Bible: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, pretty much the characters that we hear about in Genesis. And from that period until the conquest of Canaan, where we find Palestine in the late second millennium of 2000 BC. Many nations lived in the Canaan before the Israelites, including the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Jebusites, and the Arameans. Therefore, it would seem that a lot of people who lived there before the Israelites stayed there when the Babylonian exile started in the 6th century. And according to the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, it would be a number of decades later, 60, 70 years before the Jews in Babylon were then allowed to return to the land of Judah, from which time on they became known as Jews. And I thought that was interesting. Now back to the central theme of the Holy Year. Originally, it was a special year of remission of sins, debts, and universal pardon. And interestingly, we do find this particular tradition found in the Bible, in the book of Leviticus, in which a Jubilee year is mentioned to occur every 50th year, during which the mercies of God would be particularly manifest. Slaves and prisoners would be freed, debts would be forgiven, and land returned to its original owner in order to show that all the land really belonged to God. Listen to Leviticus 25. The Lord said to Moses at Mount Sinai, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I am going to give you, the land itself must observe a Sabbath to the Lord." What I found to be particularly interesting here was the story behind the story. Tradition has it that the book of Leviticus was written by Moses in about 1300 BCE. Yet our modern theologians have come to the conclusion this was probably not the case, that rather this book was written between 600 and 300 BC. But what's 1,000 years in the Bible? Well, actually, 1,000 years is pretty significant because when this book was written, so likely was the book of Samuel, which put the population of Judah at about 500,000 and the 12 tribes of Israel at about 800,000 when they were basically camped out at the base of Mount Sinai waiting for Moses to bring down the tablets. Now we take a look at modern day Israel, that this was at a different times part of Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. The northern part of Israel was geographically part of the Assyrian Empire that had a population of about 1 million. Israel and Palestine were geographically one land with two names. And way back then, even to the present day, Both the Jews and the Arabs have claimed it as theirs alone. From a purely historical perspective, Israel predates Palestine by more than 1,000 years. But with the Jewish people, when they were dispersed from their homelands by the Babylonians, Palestine became home to a very substantial Arab population, which has lived there for more than 1,000 years. So, from a perspective of justice and equity, both peoples have a legitimate claim to the land. So, if anyone truly needs a Jubilee, it's probably the Israeli and Palestinian people. It is obvious from reading the book of Leviticus that these people have always been aware of the great need for universal forgiveness and mercy, certainly a mutual sign of the presence of God's original design for all of humanity, just as God commanded in the very first Jubilee. Yet both Jews and Palestinians, they concede to that universal temptation of the flesh to do their will and not the will of God. Because only in giving universal pardon can love replace hatred. So now we zoom forward from 300 BC, almost 1,600 years later. In Western Christianity, the Jubilee tradition would start, it's accredited to the year 1300 when Pope Boniface VIII convoked a holy year, following which ordinary jubilees have generally been celebrated every 25 or 50 years, with extraordinary jubilees in addition, depending on the need. Catholic jubilees, particularly in the Latin Church, generally involve a pilgrimage to a sacred site, normally the city of Rome. The Catholic Church declared an extraordinary Jubilee of Mercy for 2015-2016. The next Jubilee year commenced on, as we know, December 24th of last year, and that will be covered in much more detail in the next talk. But how ironic is this? The same 2,300-year-old concept forms the fundamental idea of the Christian Jubilee today. The number 50 was specially associated in the early 13th century with the idea of remission, which, as every reader of the sacred page is aware, is the number of remission. That's why I was kind of amused when we kept talking about 50th anniversaries today. Well, let's see here. In ancient Rome, it was said the Jubilee was the celebration coinciding with the centenaries since the founding of Rome. So here we see the Roman influence as well as the Jewish influence on Jubilee. But the Roman celebration was actually a pagan celebration that was co-opted into the tradition of our modern Jubilee. So once again, a Christian celebration that started from a somewhat pagan celebration. So how do we celebrate a Jubilee today? In Roman Catholic tradition, a Jubilee or Holy Year is a year of forgiveness of sins and also the punishment due to sin, a so-called plenary indulgence. It is a year of reconciliation between adversaries, of conversion and receiving the sacrament of reconciliation, and consequently of solidarity, hope, justice, commitment to serve God with joy and peace with our brothers and sisters. A Jubilee can be ordinary if it falls after the set period of years, or extraordinary if it is proclaimed for some outstanding event prior to 50 years. Now, this is what's interesting is that, as I said earlier, the Pope probably has the greatest influence on when the Jubilee will be declared or started. So what happened at the first Christian Jubilee? In the face of great suffering caused by wars and diseases such as the plague, thousands of pilgrims came to Rome at Christmas in 1299. And you can imagine what happened to Rome with that many people descending upon it. And Cardinal Giacomo Gaetano Stefanasci, the contemporary and counselor of Pope Boniface VIII and author of a treatise on the first Christian Jubilee, noted that the proclamation of the Jubilee owed its origin to the statements of certain pilgrims who persuaded Boniface that great indulgences had been granted to all pilgrims in Rome about 100 years before. Well, that is where I stumbled. I could not find something that based on 100 years before, because in 1300, Boniface published his bull Antiquarium Habet Fide Relationa. Probably good to explain. A papal bull in the Catholic Church is an official decree or document issued by the Pope named after the bulla traditionally attached to authenticate it. Essentially, it's a formal papal letter with a special seal signifying its importance. So learned lots of little things on the way. I told Linda, I said, it's just, when you're reading about God's work, it's just always amazing. Anyways, appealing vaguely to the precedent of past ages, Boniface declared the most full pardon of all their sins to those who fulfill certain conditions. Here's where we see the presence of the lawyers. These are at first that being truly penitent, the people must confess their sins. And secondly, they must visit the basilicas of St. Peter and St. Paul at least once a day for a specified time. In the case of inhabitants of the city, for 30 days. In the case of strangers, only 15 days. And this is why a Jubilee is usually a great call for pilgrimage to Rome. So Boniface's bull, like many papal bulls, shows the presence of this legality always lurking to set us straight on the laws of the church. I've often said if the good Lord came back to earth today and he saw our 1,756 canon laws, he would probably shake his head. But then of course you see even within the Catholic Church, our canon laws, now we have to train canon lawyers to tell us what the canon law means. But so I told Linda, I said, in doing this paper, I ended up with almost 22 pages, and I would like to make it because it is fascinating, but I will limit this study of the history up to our present time to several of the more interesting things. One of the earliest jubilees that followed, and this will show you. Let me. I'm trying to remember which pope it was. The immediate predecessor to Boniface decided that 100 years was too long. Boniface set it at 100 years. Well, you go, well, Leviticus called for 50 years. And if you remember, that was God telling the people that it would be 50 years. So now here the Pope has just decided, well, it's going to be 100 years. Well, immediately following him, his predecessor changed it back to 50 years at the urgence of cardinals. But anyways, the next history up to our current time, you see that the Pope could have the date changed at any time. It was some years, it was 33 years, but then I see portions that were as short as 10 years in between the Jubilee year. But again, it seems to always was at the discretion of the Pope. So, but that's pretty much it. I'd love to answer any questions, and I will also say that I think we talked about this, Linda, where we can find a way to post these talks, because there's a lot of interesting facts, and like I said, the 22 pages would probably exceed my 15 minutes here. So, but we'll do that. And then, like I said, for our next talk, we'll specifically talk about Pope Francis's. One of the things that is very interesting, and I can't remember which exactly which was, but is the you've seen Pope Francis opening the doors into the basilica. Well, opening the door, let's see, I guess it was 1450 to 1475. You know, you went through plagues, but they actually cemented the door to the church shut. And then it was like a practice that the Pope would come and literally chip it out, and then then the concrete was falling on the attendees because you're thousands and thousands of people coming to the Jubilee. But that's where, you know, like I said, there's so many little traditions and practices that they are fascinating. But you know, as I said, we'll speak about all that in the next talk. But you've already seen the Pope pushing open the doors, and so. But again, I will be happy to post this with you so everybody can get all of the details because there are a lot of them.
Thank you so much, Deacon. Yes, and I see Tommy already has his hand up, but let me just let everybody know there is a little on my screen, it's a little heart and it has the word react. That would be where you would find the option to raise your hand if you want to do that electronically. If you're not comfortable with that, then yeah, just kind of wave your hand and raise or wave your hand at me and I'll try and catch you. But I've got you on 2 pages, so I'm going to be scrolling back and forth to make sure. I've already seen Tommy's hand go up and I see Russ has his hand raised. So Tommy, we'll start with you. Go ahead.
So, Deacon, first of all, awesome. I think truly, I think we all thirst to understand and know our faith so much better.
Yeah.
Matthew Kelly calls it a banquet, and you're just describing it. What you just said, I mean, is overload. It's like drinking out of a faucet. Thank you. What a great job. What a great job. I do have two questions, though. One is I'm going to pose it facetiously. Please take it completely facetiously. You're talking about a Jubilee year as if it's special and it's remission of sins. Well, wait a minute. I go to confession. What do I need this thing for? Why even pay attention to it? So what I'm asking is, what is it specifically that we can get from a Jubilee year that we normally could not?
Tommy, I would say that the initiative is to renew our stance on what our faith is all about. And that's why we have this every 50 years. In Leviticus, what you saw was it coincided with the land, which was very interesting. I mean, especially being in real estate development, this kind of I said, how did they make this work where the land was given back to the original landowner, whereupon the cycle began again? But it's all about everything was actually all the land was owned by God. And you start thinking, well, everything in this beautiful world is God's, and God is all love and mercy. And so it's like we become, and I think we've talked about this before, it's so easy to become distracted. And I'm a perfect example of it, where my work becomes more important than what God wants me to be doing. And he kind of redirects me. And I think this is what the Jubilee does, is a call to look. I mentioned this. There's no doubt that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's just unbelievable that it's going on. But this is why this great call for forgiveness and sins, and maybe we all live in that idea that hey, I don't need to go to confession as often as I mean, God knows I'm asking for his forgiveness, but this is a special direction to say, you know, let's renew this and look at it, and let's share it with our brothers. Just like it actually, you see the Curcio movement in that, is that we need to share this with all of our fellow Catholics. And it's a convocation of our faith.
So what I'm drawing your attention to, and this is just in a more broad rhetorical sense, most Catholics will hear the word Jubilee and they'll associate it with forgiveness of sins, and that's where it ends. You're drawing our attention to something so much broader. And I think that's where the education can occur. The second question I have is, if I understand properly my biblical history, and I may not, God gave the land to the Israelites, and therein lies, there's no need to kind of discuss this. I'm just saying that one statement, if that is true, and I believe it to be true for my history, that's that can be the reason for the conflict over there. So,
there's no doubt about it. You heard me emphasize.
You referenced the Babylonians conquering
the exile,
the Jews, and the Jews being herded out of Jerusalem, and that vacuum being filled, and so by the Palestinians, and that land, Palestine, as you have mentioned, is Palestine / Israel. So anyway, thank you, Deacon. What a great job! What a great job! Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tommy, for asking your question. We've got 4 people lined up for more questions. So obviously you have definitely hooked into something here. I am going to take those 4 questions. We have Russ, then Bob, then Paula, then Bill Jeschuk. And Bill has asked me to ask that question. So we'll go in that order. And then unfortunately, we are going to stop that conversation and move into our next discussion of chapter 11. But if you have more questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and I will share them with Deacon and we will try and get answers before I send the follow-up notes out from today's meeting. So again, if you have other questions, please put them in the chat or you can send me an email and we'll ask Deacon those questions after this meeting. So Russ, go ahead. What is your question or comment?
First of all, the comment is that there is a great article in the current miscellany for this month on Jubilee 2025. The part of that is that the pilgrimages identified can be made on a local basis, and that is we have 2 basilicas, maybe others in our diocese, and one being at in Charleston, and the other we have a minor basilica here at St. Peter's in Columbia. So these are also places that can be utilized for these indulgences that are specified by Deacon Coleman. So those are just some areas of additional information. So I don't have a particular question. Thank you, Deacon Coleman.
If you read this entire, I told Linda, I said I went, I had to reduce it to about 4 pages of information for this 15 minutes, but I had 22 pages. And in the history, you will see periods when some of the popes actually held jubilees for the monetary benefit to Rome. Now, is that crazy? But they realize that all these people come in just like today. They coming in and they're spending money, but then it created huge problems because if you looked at ancient Rome, there weren't that many hotels and inns, as Jesus knows, as Jesus' mother certainly knows. So there weren't restaurants and hotels everywhere. So it created huge problems, and so because of that, one of the popes finally said in his discretion that, okay, you visitors, you can do this at your own church. And that's where that tradition changed. Isn't that interesting?
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Bob?
First of all, I would like to commend Deacon on such a thorough history there. I mean, to do that much research and to pull that much information is very helpful for us to kind of put things in historical terms. When Tommy's comment, as self-described as being somewhat facetious, talks about, well, hey, we can go to confession. Why do we need a Jubilee year? When you think of confession, that's like a personal, that's a personal forgiveness of sins. But the Jubilee is kind of a worldwide faith follower kind of movement to focus on a particular forgiveness or on a particular concept or idea, and that's why I guess that's why it comes from Rome, from the Pope, and so that's something that we should all focus our attention on. And again, like I say, Deacon Coleman, just a tremendous amount of research there. I'm very impressed. You probably did very well in school on that kind of research. That was amazing.
Did you get that check for $50 I said, Bob?
And just a reminder, that was in 1 week. He just learned of this request to do this talk 1 week ago today.
I'm very impressed. That was just fantastic. Absolutely fantastic.
Paula, did you have a question? I see you put it in the chat. Do you want me to read it, or do you want to ask it, or what do you want me to do?
Yeah, I just had an aha moment, making this connection of the release of prisoners, which I never really thought much about. And I wasn't even, it's been all over the news about the removal from death row of some of our prisoners by our current president. And I didn't even make that possible connection until I heard this really wonderful explanation today. And so, although, many may not consider our current president to be a fully practicing Catholic, I'm just curious about whether or not he had the Jubilee in mind when he made this decision. So just an observation. I just thought it was just an interesting timing. So that's all.
Well, I think you heard, Linda's telling. I called Linda up. I was so excited when I did this paper because it's going back to being a deacon and preparing for a homily. I always learn so much in a different gospel, but this was just fascinating. But it went all the way back. Everybody should read Leviticus, and you will see God gave us, I say, being descendants of Abraham, you look at it and you say, well, God gave them the promised land, but there were some small problems in that the promised land was already occupied by people. And then to further complicate it, God laid down a lot of conditions and said, these are the conditions for you to live happy and peacefully in this land. And they did not do it. And the prophets told them, they said, if you do not follow the word of God, your city will be destroyed. And we all know the history of Jerusalem being burned to the ground many, many times. So it just gets more fascinating from there. But I like I said, I loved every bit of this, and I will, despite your accolades and pats on the back here, most of it is plagiarized right out of the Bible and other books that, by very scholarly people. But the one thing that I do see in all my studies over the years, and you can probably see this too, is that theologians change like the weather on their positions and things, which is it may be why we have so many different religions in the world. I think the precepts of Jesus Christ are so simple and so clear until man starts looking at those words and goes, well, what I think God meant, and that's where we err. And I'm going to leave it at that.
So there's one final question, and then we'll move on to our discussion of chapter 11. And it really is some clarification. I know you addressed it to some extent as far as the number of days and how the Pope has the kind of the freedom to make it however frequently the Jubilee year needs to be. But in the Bible, it also talks about the every 7 years where land and slaves were freed. Do you have any information about how that 7 years ties
Sure.
in?
Sure. There's actually, you get into the calendar that is associated with it, and you have the 7 times 7 years, which ultimately came up to 49 years, and that's where the 50 years was originally picked. And that's from God, but you see the 7 times 7 throughout our Bible. That it's like I said, it's the ultimate indication of remission of sin. Jesus saying, "How many times must we forgive?" We must 7 times 7. Well, then it gets complicated. They said, well, you've got one group of scholars saying, well, 7 times 7 is 49. The year of the Jubilee is, according to the other group of theologians, a year in itself. Then we get into even more details found in Leviticus about, well, to celebrate that Jubilee year, you stop growing crops, you stop planting the vineyards, you let whatever the earth produces, that's what you lived on. And it was said in that book that would produce enough food for a period of 3 years. So you had one group of theologians saying, well, 49 is 49, and that's where they hung their hat. Where the other group said, but see, God allowed for that food for a 3-year period, so that's the 50th year. They argued over, well, you wouldn't have enough food if you didn't plant for a 2-year period, being that in the Jubilee year you're not supposed to plant. So it's just like I said, you get people involved and they start arguing, and you're going to have one group walk out the door that thinks this is what, like I said, what God meant is very clear to me. And but you forgive and you share what you have been given by me, and that's where we err.
Thank you so much, Deacon. I'm going to stop our recording there.